Introduction. You might be suffering from capitalism. The argument of this book can be summed up succinctly. Unregulated capitalism is bad for women, and if we adopt some ideas from socialism, women will have better lives. If done properly, socialism leads to economic independence, better labor conditions, better work-family balance, and yes, even better sex. Finding a way into a better future requires learning from the mistakes of the past, including a thoughtful assessment of the history of 20th century state socialism in Eastern Europe. That's it. If you like the idea of such outcomes, then come along for an exploration of how we might change things. If you are dubious because you don't understand why capitalism as an economic system is uniquely bad for women, and if you doubt that there could ever be anything good about socialism, this short treatise will provide some illumination. If you don't give a whit about women's lives because you're a gynophobic right-wing internet troll, save your money and get back to your parents' basement right now. This isn't the book for you. Of course, some might argue that unregulated capitalism sucks for almost everyone, but I want to focus on how capitalism disproportionately harms women. Competitive labor markets discriminate against those whose reproductive biology makes them primarily responsible for childbearing. Today, this means humans who get pink hats in the hospital and the letter F next to the name on their birth certificate, as if we've already failed by not coming into the world as a boy. Competitive labor markets also devalue those expected to be the primary caregivers of children. Although societal attitudes have evolved in this regard, our idealization of motherhood means that most of us still believe that baby needs mama a whole lot more than papa, at least until the child is old enough to play sports. Others will argue that unregulated capitalism is not bad for all women. Yes, for those women lucky enough to sit at the top of the income distribution, the system works pretty well. Although women at the executive level still face gender pay gaps and remain underrepresented in leadership positions, on the whole, things aren't too shabby for the Sheryl Sandbergs of the world. Of course, sexual harassment still hinders progress even for those at the top, and too many women believe that if you want to run with the big dogs, you may have to suck it up and ignore the groping and unwanted advances. And race plays an important role as well. White women do a lot better in aggregate than do women of color. But when we look at society as a whole, on average, women are comparatively worse off in countries where markets are less encumbered by regulation, taxation, and public enterprises than they are in nations where state revenues support greater levels of redistribution and larger social safety nets. Choose your data source, and you find the same story. Unemployment and poverty plague women with children. Employers discriminate against women without children because they might have them in the future. In the United States in 2013, women over the age of 65 suffered from poverty at much greater rates than men, and dominated those in the category of extreme poverty. Globally, women face higher rates of economic deprivation. Women are often the last to be hired and the first to be fired in cyclical downturns. And when they do find employment, bosses pay them less than men. When states need to slash government spending on education, healthcare, or old-age pensions, mothers, daughters, sisters, and wives must pick up the slack, diverting their energies to care for the young, the sick, and the elderly. Capitalism thrives on women's unpaid labor in the home because women's care work supports lower taxes. Lower taxes means higher profits for those already at the top of the income ladder, mostly men. But capitalism was not always so savage. Throughout much of the 20th century, state socialism presented an existential challenge to the worst excesses of the free market. The threat posed by Marxist ideologies forced Western governments to expand social safety nets to protect workers from the unpredictable but inevitable booms and busts of the capitalist economy. After the Berlin Wall fell, many celebrated the triumph of the West, consigning socialist ideas to the dustbin of history. But for all its faults, state socialism provided an important foil for capitalism. It was in response to a global discourse of social and economic rights, a discourse that appealed not only to the progressive populations of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, but also to many men and women in Western Europe and North America, that politicians agreed to improve working conditions for wage laborers, as well as create social programs for children, the poor, the elderly, the sick, and the disabled, mitigating exploitation and the growth of income inequality. Although there were important antecedents in the 1980s, once state socialism collapsed, capitalism shook off the constraints of market regulation and income redistribution. Without the looming threat of a rival superpower, the last 30 years of global neoliberalism have witnessed a rapid shriveling of social programs that protect citizens from cyclical instability and financial crises, and reduce the vast inequality of economic outcomes between those at the top and bottom of the income distribution. For much of the 20th century, Western capitalist countries also endeavored to outdo the East European countries in terms of women's rights, fueling progressive social change. For example, the state socialists in the USSR and Eastern Europe were so successful at giving women economic opportunities outside the home that initially, for 2 decades after the end of World War II, women's wage work was conflated with the evils of communism. The American way of life meant male breadwinners and female homemakers. But slowly, socialist championing of women's emancipation began to chip away at their Leave It to Beaver ideal. The Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957 spurred American leaders to rethink the costs of maintaining traditional gender roles. They feared the state socialists enjoyed an advantage in technological development because they had double the brain power. The Russians educated women and funneled the best and the brightest into scientific research. Fearing Eastern Bloc superiority in the space race, the American government passed the National Defense Education Act, NDEA, in 1958. Despite a continuing cultural desire for women to stay at home as dependent wives, the NDEA created new opportunities for talented girls to study science and math. Then, in 1961, President John F. Kennedy signed Executive Order 10980 to establish the first Presidential Commission on the Status of Women, citing national security concerns. This commission, chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, laid the groundwork for the future U.S. women's movement. Americans received a further shock in 1963 when Valentina Tereshkova became the first female cosmonaut, spending more time orbiting the Earth than all male astronauts in the United States had, combined. Later, Soviet and East European dominance at the Olympics spurred the passage of Title IX, so that the United States could identify and train more female athletes to snatch gold medals away from the ideological enemy. In response to state socialist prowess in the sciences, the American government sponsored an important study titled Women in the Soviet Economy. The head of the study visited the USSR in 1955, 1962, and 1965 to examine Soviet policies to integrate women into the formal labor force as an example for American legislators. Concern in recent years on the waste of women's talent and labor potential led to the appointment of the President's Commission on the Status of Women, which has issued a series of reports on various problems affecting women and their participation in economic, political, and social life. The 1966 report began. For any formulation of policy directed toward the better use of our women power, it is important to know the experience of other nations in utilizing the capabilities of women. For this reason, as well as others, the Soviet experience is of particular interest at this time. The precedent set by the state socialist countries in Eastern Europe acted as an influential example for American politicians. At the same historical moment that Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique, and revealed how unsatisfied middle-class white women felt with their circumscribed domestic lives. But in the current political climate, it may be hard to fathom how a rivalry between superpowers could have sparked interest in the status of women. Today, socialist ideas are enjoying a renaissance, as young people across countries such as the United States, France, Great Britain, Greece, and Germany find inspiration in politicians like Bernie Sanders, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, Jeremy Corbyn, Yanis Varoufakis, and Sarah Wagenknecht. Citizens desire an alternative political path that would lead to a more egalitarian and sustainable future. To move forward, we must be able to discuss the past with no ideologically motivated attempts to whitewash or blackwash either our own history or the accomplishments of state socialism. On the one hand, any nuanced account of 20th century state socialism will inevitably encounter the sputtering and bluster of those who insist that it was pure evil. End of story. As the Czech writer Milan Kundera wrote in his famous novel The Unbearable Lightness of Being, the people who struggle against what we call totalitarian regimes cannot function with queries and doubts. They, too, need certainties and simple truths to make the multitudes understand, to provoke collective tears. On the other hand, some young people today joke about full communism now. Leftist millennials might not know about, or prefer to ignore, the real horrors inflicted on citizens in one-party states. Gruesome tales of the secret police, travel restrictions, consumer shortages, and labor camps are not just anti-communist propaganda. Our collective future depends on a balanced examination of the past, so we can discard the bad and move forward with the good, especially where women's rights are concerned. Since the middle of the 19th century, European social theorists argued that the female sex is uniquely disadvantaged in an economic system that prizes profits and private property over people. Throughout the 1970s, socialist feminists in the United States also asserted that smashing the patriarchy wasn't enough. Exploitation and inequality would persist so long as financial elites built their fortunes on the backs of docile women reproducing the labor force for free. But these early critiques were based on abstract theories, with little empirical evidence to substantiate them. Slowly, over the course of the first half of the 20th century, new democratic socialist and state socialist governments in Europe began to test these theories in practice. In East Germany, Scandinavia, the Soviet Union, and Eastern Europe, political leaders supported the idea of women's emancipation through their full incorporation into the labor force. These ideas soon spread to China, Cuba, and a wide variety of newly independent countries across the globe. Experiments with female economic independence fueled the 20th century women's movement and resulted in a revolution in the life paths open to women previously confined to the domestic sphere. And nowhere in the world were there more women in the workforce than under state socialism. Women's emancipation infused the ideology of almost all state socialist regimes, with the Franco-Russian revolutionary Inessa Armand famously declaring, "If women's liberation is unthinkable without communism, then communism is unthinkable without women's liberation." Although important differences existed between countries, and none achieved full equality in practice, these nations did expend vast resources to invest in women's education and training, and to promote them in professions previously dominated by men. Understanding the demands of reproductive biology, they also attempted to socialize domestic work and childcare by building a network of public creches, kindergartens, laundries, and cafeterias. Extended job-protected maternity leaves and child benefits allowed women to find at least a modicum of work-family balance. Moreover, 20th century state socialism did improve the material conditions of millions of women's lives. Maternal and infant mortality declined, life expectancy increased, and illiteracy all but disappeared. To take just one example, the majority of Albanian women were illiterate before the imposition of socialism in 1945. Just 10 years later, the entire population under 40 could read and write, and by the 1980s, half of Albania's university students were women. While different countries pursued different policies, in general, state socialist governments reduced women's economic dependence on men by making men and women equal recipients of services from the socialist state. These policies helped to decouple love and intimacy from economic considerations. When women enjoy their own sources of income, and the state guarantees social security in old age, illness, and disability, women have no economic reason to stay in abusive, unfulfilling, or otherwise unhealthy relationships. In countries such as Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and East Germany, women's economic independence translated into a culture in which personal relationships could be freed from market influences. Women didn't have to marry for money. Of course, just as we can learn from the experiences of Eastern Europe, we shouldn't ignore the downsides. Women's rights in the Eastern Bloc failed to include a concern for same-sex couples and gender nonconformity. Abortion served as a primary form of birth control in the countries where it was available on demand. Most East European states strongly encouraged women to become mothers, with Romania, Albania, and the USSR under Stalin forcing women to have children they didn't want. State socialist governments suppressed discussions of sexual harassment, domestic violence, and rape. And although they tried to get men involved in housework and childcare, men largely resisted challenges to traditional gender roles. Many women suffered under a double burden of mandatory formal employment and domestic work, as so well captured in Natalia Baranskaya's brilliant novella, A Week Like Any Other. Finally, in no country were women's rights promoted as a project to support women's individualism or self-actualization. Instead, the state supported women as workers and mothers, so they could participate more fully in the collective life of the nation. After the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, new democratic governments rapidly privatized state assets and dismantled social safety nets. Men under these newly emerging capitalist economies regained their natural roles as family patriarchs, and women were expected to return home as mothers and wives supported by their husbands. Across Eastern Europe, post-1989 nationalists argued that capitalist competition would relieve women of the notorious double burden and restore familial and societal harmony by allowing men to reassert their masculine authority as breadwinners. However, this meant that men could once again wield financial power over women. For instance, the renowned historian of sexuality, Dagmar Herzog, shared a conversation with several East German men in their late 40s in 2006. They told her that it was really annoying that East German women had so much sexual self-confidence and economic independence. Money was useless, they complained. The few extra Eastern marks that a doctor could make in contrast with, say, someone who worked in the theatre, did absolutely no good, they explained, in luring or retaining women the way a doctor's salary could and did in the West. You had to be interesting. What pressure! And as one revealed, I have much more power now as a man in unified Germany than I ever did in communist days. Furthermore, following the publication of my New York Times op-ed, Why Women Had Better Sex Under Socialism, I did an interview with Doug Henwood on his radio show, Behind the News. One listener, a 46-year-old woman born in the Soviet Union, emailed the show to say that I had nailed it in my discussion of romantic relations in the old country, as she called it, but also the way men lord it over women with money here, in the United States. The collapse of state socialism in 1989 created a perfect laboratory to investigate the effects of capitalism on women's lives. The world could watch as free markets were conjured from the rubble of the planned economy, and these new markets variously affected different categories of workers. After decades of shortages, East Europeans eagerly exchanged authoritarianism for the promise of democracy and economic prosperity, throwing their countries open to Western capital and international trade. But there were unforeseen costs. The rejection of the one-party state and the embrace of political freedoms came bundled with economic neoliberalism. New democratic governments privatized public enterprises to make room for new competitive labor markets where productivity would determine wages. Gone were the long lines for toilet paper and the black markets for jeans. Coming soon was a glorious consumer paradise free from shortages, famines, the secret police, and the labor camp. But after almost 3 decades, many Eastern Europeans still wait for a bright capitalist future. Others have abandoned all hope. The evidence is incontrovertible. Like so many other women across the globe, women in Eastern Europe are once again commodities to be bought and sold, their price determined by the fickle fluctuations of supply and demand. Writing in the immediate aftermath of state socialism's collapse, the Croatian journalist Slavenka Drakulic explained, "We live surrounded by newly opened porno shops, porno magazines, peep shows, stripteases, unemployment and galloping poverty. In the press they call Budapest the city of love, the Bangkok of Eastern Europe. Romanian women are prostituting themselves for $1 at the Romanian-Yugoslav border. In the midst of all this, our anti-choice nationalist governments are threatening our right to abortion and telling us to multiply, to give birth to more Poles, Hungarians, Czechs, Croats, Slovaks. Today, Russian mail-order brides, Ukrainian sex workers, Moldovan nannies, and Polish maids flood Western Europe. Unscrupulous middlemen harvest blonde hair from poor Belarusian teenagers for New York wig makers. In St. Petersburg, women attend academies for aspiring gold diggers. Prague is an epicenter of the European porn industry. Human traffickers prowl the streets of Sofia, Bucharest, and Chisinau for hapless girls dreaming of a more prosperous life in the West. Older citizens of Eastern Europe fondly recall the small comforts and predictability of their life before 1989, free education and healthcare, no fear of unemployment, and of not having money to meet basic needs. A joke, told in many East European languages, illustrates this sentiment. In the middle of the night, a woman screams and jumps out of bed, eyes filled with terror. Her startled husband watches her rush into the bathroom and open the medicine cabinet. She then dashes to the kitchen and inspects the inside of the refrigerator. Finally, she flings open a window and gazes out onto the street below their apartment. She takes a deep breath and returns to bed. "What's wrong with you?" her husband says. "What happened?" "I had a terrible nightmare," she says. "I dreamed that we had the medicine we needed, that our refrigerator was full of food, and that the streets outside were safe and clean." "How is that a nightmare?" The woman shakes her head and shudders. "I thought the communists were back in power." Opinion polls throughout the region continue to show that many citizens believe their lives were better before 1989, under authoritarianism. Although these polls may say more about disappointment with the present than they do about the desirability of the past, they complicate the totalitarian narrative. For example, a 2013 random poll of 1,055 adult Romanians found that only a third reported that their lives were worse off before 1989. 44% said their lives were better, and 16% said there was no change. These results were also gendered in interesting ways. Whereas 47% of women thought that state socialism was better for their country, only 42% of men said the same. Similarly, whereas 36% of men claimed that life was worse before 1989, only 31% of women said life under the dictator Nicolae Ceausescu was worse than the present. And this is from Romania, one of the most corrupt and oppressive regimes in the former Eastern Bloc, where Ceausescu gold-plated the flushing handle on his private toilet. Similar results emerged from surveys in Poland in 2011, and from an opinion poll conducted in 8 other former socialist nations in 2009. For citizens who have had the opportunity to live under 2 different economic systems, Many now feel that capitalism is worse than the state socialism they were once so eager to cast aside. Back in the United States, the collapse of East European state socialism ushered in an era of Western capitalist triumphalism. Great society ideas about how to regulate our economy and redistribute wealth to maximize the well-being of all citizens, including women, fell out of favor. The rise of what was called the Washington Consensus, born of Reaganomics, meant marketization, privatization, and the shredding of social safety nets in the name of efficiency. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, citizens witnessed increasing deregulation of the financial, transportation, and utility sectors, and the growing commodification of everyday life. We conflated freedom with free markets. After the global financial crisis in 2008, economic elites targeted already lean state budgets, slashing deeper into social programs, while using taxpayer monies to bail out the bankers who created much of the mess in the first place. Occupy Wall Street called attention to structural inequality, but politicians on both sides of the aisle met rising public anger with the same old line: there is no alternative to capitalism. This is a lie. Conservative cold warriors will counter any attempt to complicate the history of 20th century state socialism with screaming about Stalin's famines and purges. In their imagination, the entire experience of state socialism consisted of people standing in bread lines and snitching on their neighbors to the secret police. For 70 years in the Soviet Union and 45 years in Eastern Europe, totalitarian leaders apparently shuttled everyone back and forth between labor camps and prisons. A godless Orwellian nightmare where people wore grey, unisex Mao suits and sported shaved heads. If babies were born, it's not because people chose to start families, but because the party mass-inseminated the population to meet predetermined human production quotas. Anti-communists refused to acknowledge the important differences among the wide variety of societies that embraced socialism, or to credit them for their various achievements in science, education, health outcomes, culture, and sport. In the stereotypes promoted by Western leaders, state socialism was an inefficient economic system, doomed to inevitable collapse, and a terrifying red menace requiring billions of dollars of taxpayer money to contain. It's odd to consider how it could have been both. Within Eastern Europe today, numerous Western-funded research institutes investigate the crimes of communism. In countries like Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania, all German allies in World War II, the descendants of Nazi collaborators are keen to paint themselves as victims of communism. Local politicians and economic elites who benefited from the transition to free markets, particularly those who had the previously nationalized property of their grandparents restituted to them after 1989, collude to create one official totalitarian narrative about the past. For example, after a lecture I gave in Vienna in 2011, a young Bulgarian woman in the audience sent an email thanking me for my courage in discussing some of the positive legacies of Todor Zhivkov, Bulgaria's leader from 1954 to 1989. No one in Bulgaria can talk about the nostalgia and the pains of transition without being framed as a communist and as someone who denies the crimes of the Zhivkov regime. So the important issues you deal with are not present in the discourse or media. In nearby Romania, the literary scholar Costi Rogozanu has criticized the East European practice of using horror stories about the state socialist past to justify the continued implementation of neoliberal economic policies in the present. Do you want a salary raise? You are communist. Do you want public services? Do you want to tax the rich and ease the burden on small producers and wage earners? You are a communist and you killed my grandparents. Do you want public transportation instead of highways? You are mega-communist and a stupid hipster. Although it's important not to romanticize the state socialist past, the ugly realities should not make us completely oblivious to the ideals of the early socialists, to the various attempts to reform the system from within, such as the Prague Spring, Glasnost, or Perestroika, or to the important role that socialist ideals played in inspiring national independence movements in the global South. Acknowledging the bad does not negate the good. Just as there are those who would like to whitewash American history by downplaying, just for starters, Jim Crow, institutional racism, gun violence, or the unprecedented incarceration rate, there are those who would blackwash the history of state socialism, insisting that everything was evil. Today, we have over 200 years of experimentation with various forms of socialism, but the word socialism still carries negative connotations. Howls about Stalin's Gulag and Ukrainian famines meet any mention of socialist principles. Opponents decry it as an economic system doomed to failure and inevitably leading to totalitarian terror, while ignoring the successful democratic socialist nations in Scandinavia. Europe was a battleground in the Cold War, and the northern European countries once had large domestic communist and socialist parties that participated in the parliamentary process, promoting policies that ensured redistribution and social welfare. In the 1990s, while Russia, Hungary, and Poland liquidated state assets and dismantled their social safety nets, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland maintained generous public spending financed by government-owned industries and progressive taxation, despite the global fashion for neoliberalism. The democratic socialist societies of Northern Europe show that it's possible to find a humane alternative to neoliberal capitalism, and although they aren't perfect or easy to replicate, they are ethnically homogeneous and increasingly hostile to immigrants. They have found ways to combine the political freedoms of the West with the social securities of the East. Northern Europe is not only the happiest place to live in the world, but an oasis for women who enjoy more economic and political power than anywhere else on the planet. In a brilliant article in Dissent, Cock-blocked by Redistribution, a pickup artist in Denmark, Katie J.M. Baker exposed how the American womanizer Dariusz Valizade, a.k.a. Rush, warned his fans that Denmark was a veritable desert for men on the hunt for easy women. The country's generous social safety net and gender-equalizing policies apparently render Valizade's alpha male seduction techniques useless, because Danish women don't need men for financial security. In less egalitarian countries, women understand that sexual relationships provide an avenue for social mobility, the Cinderella fantasy. But when women earn their own money and live in societies where the state supports their independence, Prince Charming loses his appeal. Rush's book, Don't Bang Denmark, stands as a testament to the idea that redistributive policies can provide women the stability and security that mitigates the effects of discrimination in daily life. Young people are rediscovering the idea that democratic governments have a role in ensuring a just economy. Today, corporations and wealthy elites influence politicians to do their bidding through campaign contributions and hired lobbyists, cut services for the poor to slash taxes for the rich. The 2010 Supreme Court decision in Citizens United versus FEC affirmed the idea that money equals speech, and therefore deserved protection under the First Amendment of the Constitution. But as long as the United States remains a representative democracy, ordinary people can vote their economic interests and choose leaders who will pursue policies of redistribution and support social safety nets for all. By 2020, millennial voters will make up the largest demographic group of the American electorate, and young women make up half of the millennial population. The math here is simple. A June 2015 Gallup poll found that Americans ages 18 to 29 were more willing to vote for a socialist presidential candidate than any other age cohort, and this was well before Bernie Sanders' primary campaign was in full swing. In addition, a January 2016 YouGov poll asked Americans, "Do you have a favorable or an unfavorable opinion of socialism?" The results showed a stark difference in the opinions of different age cohorts. For those over the age of 65, 60% had an unfavorable opinion of socialism, compared to the 23% that reported a favorable opinion. For those between the ages of 30 and 64, about a quarter reported a positive idea of socialism, but half of 30 to 44-year-olds and 54% of 45 to 64-year-olds maintained a negative view. Among the 18 to 29-year-olds, only about one quarter had an unfavorable view of socialism. A whopping 43% had a favorable opinion, greater than the percentage of 18 to 29-year-olds who had a positive opinion of capitalism, 32%. A follow-up poll by the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation in October 2017 found that support for socialism continues to increase among the young. For starters, as of this year, more millennials would prefer to live in a socialist country, 44%, than in a capitalist one, 42%, or even a communist country, 7%. The percentage of millennials who would prefer socialism to capitalism is a full 10 points higher than that of the general population. The significance of this finding cannot be overstated. As of last year, millennials surpassed baby boomers as the largest generational cohort in American society. This same study revealed fascinating gender differences in opinions on whether respondents viewed either capitalism or socialism as favorable or unfavorable. Of the 2,300 Americans surveyed, women made up 51% of the sample, and their opinions often diverged significantly from those of men. When asked if they had a favorable view of capitalism as an economic system, 56% of men surveyed agreed, compared to only 44% of women, a 12 percentage point difference. Alternatively, 53% of men had an unfavorable view of socialism, compared to only 47% of women. Although men tended to have stronger political opinions overall, these gender differences suggest that women voters are more inclined toward redistributive policies. And these changes in political opinions are despite the efforts of conservative politicians to conflate all leftist ideals with the worst horrors of Stalinism. Perhaps millennials don't trust the authority of the baby boomer cold warriors, or perhaps the economic realities of the present day, with growing inequality and stagnant earnings for the bottom half of the income distribution, are more real than ghost stories about an evil empire that fell before they were born. George Orwell once wrote, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." Conservatives will do anything to suppress evidence that socialist experiments in the 20th century, despite their collapse, did some good things for women, including policies that have been and can be implemented in democratic societies. Paid maternity leaves, publicly funded childcare, shorter and more flexible work weeks, free post-secondary education, universal health care, and other programs that would help both men and women to lead less precarious and more fulfilling lives. Many of these socialistic policies already exist in advanced Western countries where Fox News and knee-jerk anti-communism don't deter citizens from voting in their economic interests. The current hyper-polarized political climate mitigates against a more nuanced view of the past. Conservative critics care little about the history of 20th century state socialism and its policies toward women. They want to maintain the status quo. For instance, the Washington, D.C.-based Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation claims that an entire generation of Americans is open to collectivist ideas because they don't know the truth. We tell the truth about communism because our vision is for a world free from the false hope of communism. Notice the slippage between collectivist ideas and communism, as if the former always and inevitably become the latter. If I want to own my snowblower in common with my neighbors, it must be because I'm secretly hoping they'll get sent to the gulag. This foundation designs high school curricula, pays for anti-communist billboards on Times Square, and hopes to build a Victims of Communism museum near the National Mall in Washington, D.C., with funding from explicitly right-wing donors. They want to control history in the same way that the Soviet Union once manufactured the past to suit its own political ends. If you challenge their single-minded focus on the worst aspects of the past, you challenge their assertion that socialism will always fail, no matter how or where it is tried in the future. Millennials and members of Generation Z reject the Cold War baggage of their elders, who once proclaimed, "better dead than red." Young people wonder whether their lives would be less harried, insecure, and stressful if the government took a more active role in redistribution. They have incentives to vote for leaders who understand that markets boom and bust, and that ordinary people need protection from the sudden and often savage fluctuations of free markets. Right-wing populist leaders will try to scapegoat women, people of color, and immigrants to deflect blame from the real roots of economic injustice: the high concentration of wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer people. As ordinary men and women struggle and scramble to cover their basic needs, in an economy that promises equal opportunities for social mobility, but in which 78% of African American children, born between 1985 and 2000, grew up in highly disadvantaged neighborhoods, compared to only 5% of white children, citizens must join together to effect real political change. Let's be clear. I don't advocate a return to any form of 20th century state socialism. Those experiments failed under the weight of their own contradictions, the vast chasm between their stated ideals and the actual practices of authoritarian leaders. You shouldn't have to sacrifice toilet paper for medical care. Basic political freedoms don't need to be traded for guaranteed employment. But there were other paths not taken, such as those envisioned by early socialist theorists like Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, and no socialist experiment was ever allowed to flourish without facing the overt or covert opposition of the United States, whether direct confrontations like those in Korea and Vietnam, or secret operations in places such as Cuba, Chile, or Nicaragua. Did somebody say Iran-Contra affair? Besides, the historical circumstances of the 21st century differ from those of the 20th century. As our global economy evolves and changes in response to new technologies, citizens need access to a theoretical toolkit that contains the widest array of potential political solutions to the problems we will face in the coming years. Just as European peasants once believed that God anointed kings and aristocrats to rule over them, today many believe the super-rich have earned their money in a fair competition in free markets. But as suspicions of the so-called rigged economy grow, more and more youth are searching for alternatives. The 17th century philosopher Spinoza once said, "If you want the future to be different from the present, study the past." Even if past experiments with socialism failed, there were a few successes. We should study these successes and salvage what we can of the most powerful theoretical and practical tools we have to limit the worst excesses of global capitalism today. Young women in particular have little to lose and much to gain from a collective effort to build more just, equitable, and sustainable societies. This book explains why.